Hey, this is Too Fast here, and in this video I will be doing another remote start system in my vehicle, and this time I'll be installing it into my Nissan Quest, and I'll be using the Audiovox Prestige APS997E, and this time the bypass module, instead of the Flashlogic FLCAN, I'll be using the iDataLink ALCA. And again, the ALCA is the same hardware as the FLCAN. The only difference is that the FLCAN comes with the proper cable to connect to any Audiovox alarm system. So that's the only difference. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and prep the wires I need for both of these items. And then I will begin the installation. Now, if you did watch my previous video on the other install, I did mention that you do have to prep the wire properly so that you don't have a big mess of wiring underneath the dash when it comes to the installation. So that is why I'm going to take some time to prepare all the wires that I'll be using to connect into the vehicle. And let me go over the parts. You have this Siren here. This will be mounted in the engine compartment. Here's a shock sensor, the wiring harness for the shock sensor, the brain for the remote starter alarm system, two remotes, two-way remote, one-way remote. This heavy gauge wire harness is the power starter accessory ignition wire, and here is the 3-in-1 combo. This one has the valet switch, LED, and the built-in antenna inside this module. This is the wiring harness that connects the antenna piece to the alarm brain. This one is the lock and lock wiring harness. Here is the ground and parking light wiring harness. These are the door lock, channel output, tack wire, all the hardwire that you need to do if you're going to be connecting this using the wire-to-wire mode in the bypass module. In this install, I will be doing a data mode installation, so a lot of these wires will not be used. Here's a pin switch. And for this vehicle, I probably will need to install this pin switch because I don't believe it has a factory hood release wiring built in. And here's a battery, AAA battery for the two-way remote right here. And there's a starter kill relay. You don't have to install this, but the installation guide do show you how to install this if you want to. And of course, over here on the right is the ALCA bypass module with its own wiring harness in here. So I'll leave that later on, but first I'm going to prep the alarm system, the remote start system here. Here is the shock sensor wire. This one I'm just going to use a drill here and twist it together. So here's a shock sensor wire. This one here is the lock unlock wire, and I will not be using this because I'll be using the data mode in the bypass module. Here is the ground and parking light. Let's first prep the power harness and again review the wiring diagram for the alarm module and then figure out which wire you need. For this Nissan Quest, I will have the constant power hooked up, ignition 1. There's going to be two accessories, accessory 1 and 2. There's also going to be two start wires for this vehicle. If you look at the wiring diagram, you'll notice that this wiring harness does not show you a wire for accessory number 2. So what you'll need to do is program this green wire here and set it as the accessory wire, so behave like accessory. By default, that green wire is ignition number 2. The other thing is that this install for my Nissan Quest do require a starter number 2, a second starter. And if you look at this, there is no second starter here. So what you'll have to do is get a relay and utilize a black-yellow wire, which is pulse, negative pulse string crank. And that is a negative input, so you'll have to hook up a relay. Now, on the harness itself, I will not be using any of the ignition 2 or ignition 3 wire. These two right here, the pink and the red-black, is my ignition number 3 wire from the alarm. I will not be using this, so I am going to cut these off. Now, the reason I'm cutting it off is because this wire can be used for my starter number 2. I like to put a piece of tape on the end of these fuse, because if you look at the end, there are actually two test points you can use to test whether the fuse is good or bad. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a piece of tape over it. Same for the other fuse. The red, white, and the red wire, these two, are constant 12. So these two will be tied together to connect to the same point. Here I've organized the wires so I know which one goes where. And these three over here is the constant 12 volt that I need to connect to the car. And the ignition 3 wires, which I cut off earlier, will be used for starter number 2. And here's a relay. So let me go ahead and prep that and connect that up to the relay. So this constant 12 wire is going to provide the power to the starter number 2, and also this additional wire I added is to energize the relay. So this one here is going to go to 30. This one is going to go to either 85 or 86. That's to energize the relay. This is the output, and output is going to go to 87. 87A, the middle one, is going to be normally closed, and we will not be using that. So this last pin over here is going to go out to the negative input to the alarm system. On this other wiring harness, this is the parking light input, output, and the ground. The parking light for this vehicle will be positive or 12 volt, so I will go ahead and tap this onto one of the power wire here. In this wire stripper, carefully pull back the insulation. And I'm going to go ahead and tap 2 wires for the constant 12 volt. I'll also need 12 volt to energize other relays to open the trunk and passenger sliding door. And this technique is the same as what I would do in the vehicle when I'm connecting these wires. To all the ignition, accessories, starter. So you want to heat this up really well and just keep on feeding solder until the solder is flowing through the entire conductor. So here's a close-up look at this. And let it cool a bit, and then what you want to do is get yourself the 3M electrical tape and wrap this up. This is positive to the siren. I also need a ground for the siren. So this is the black wire that will connect to the ground. So these 2 wires will go to the siren. What I'll do is I'll tap this ground onto the ground wire that's right here. With this connector, everything's prepped. With the 26-pin wiring harness, I've identified the wires that I'll be needing to do this install, and mainly the channel output to control the hatch and the sliding door, and also the hood pin switch, the brake input. Those are the wires, and of course one more wire for the starter number 2. The rest of them will not be used, so I'll go ahead and bundle this up and I'll tie it up. As I mentioned in the first video, I don't really like to cut all these wires, only because you might get into a situation where during the install maybe one of the signal you need from the bypass module is not working, and then you have the ability to do wire-to-wire installation. But if you've done the install many times, then of course you can cut these wires off because you're so familiar with it that you know for sure certain wires are not going to be used. So here is the black-yellow wire that'll provide the negative trigger for my second starter, and I'm just going to connect this up to my relay. So at this time the wiring harness for the remote start alarm system is done and ready to be installed. On the iDataLink ALCA module, of all the cables and connectors, these are not going to be used because I'll be using data mode. So these three here are the wires I'll need to connect to the bypass module. You'll need to refer to the install guide, and anything on the diagram that has a solid black line, especially on the right side, will need to be connected. And it tells you in the legend here that anything that is dotted, the lines that are dotted here, they are not required of using data mode. But if you're going to decide on using this in a wire-to-wire or hardwire mode, then you will not be using this data cable and instead hooking up all these hardwire. And here are the two modules. As you can see, I tie wrapped the stuff that I don't need on the bypass module. I've also tapped this blue wire. This is going to be the ignition wire that'll need to go to the ignition wire that's on the bypass module. So I've already spliced into the ignition wire and I got the butt connector on. So once I put this in the vehicle, I just connect that up. I want to mention that with the ALCA, it does not come with a brown connector that connects into the Audiovox alarm remote start system. So this is actually for the DEI alarm system, and if you look, this red one doesn't have the correct tab at the top to connect in. However, it still has the same 4-pin connection. And between the brown connector cable and this red connector cable, the pinout actually is exactly the same. So what I'll do here to make it fit is I'm going to cut off this top molding, the keyed molding here. Now you got to make sure the keyed side is still facing upwards, and then you'll be able to place this connector right in here like this. So let's go ahead and take the lower panel off. So let me show you what I'm looking at. Here's the key. If I look down right below that space, you see there's a white connector here. All the accessory, starter, ignition wire are all there, so we'll need to disconnect that 6-pin connector and tap our remote start wire into that. Let's go ahead and cut this open. We need access to all the wires in here. Now that I have access to the wires, what I'm going to do is plug this back in. The reason I want to do that is because I do want to test all the wires. So the first wire I'm going to test is going to be the green wire. This should be constant 12 volt. There it is. And the next one is going to be starter wire, which is the black-red wire. Test that. I'm going to crank it to start the car up. So that gave us 12 volt. One is cranking. Next one is going to be the second starter, black-yellow, right here. So this one should also give us 12 volt when we're cranking. There it is. Next one is going to be ignition wire, black, white. So that's ignition. When I crank it, it should have 12 volt. Yep. Little Last two is going to be accessory 1, accessory 2, which is the red for accessory 1. When I crank, it'll go to 0, and then it'll go back to 12 volt when it's running. And it'll be same for second accessory, which is white red. Second accessory right here, white red. 12 volt. When I crank, it'll be 0 volt. When I let go of the crank, it'll be 12 volt. So those are the wires. It is confirmed. And I'll begin tapping into those wires. Let's start with the black red wire, which is the starter wire. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm doing here because there was a question asked when I did my last video. What I have here is a wire stripper, and all I'm doing is I'm piercing the insulation right here, and I'm opening this up to expose the wire. Now what I'm going to do is cut this along the side, and then I'll pull the insulation off. Now from the alarm module, it'll be the yellow wire for the starter one, and I'll be connecting that to this starter one right here. I'm going to wrap this and then start soldering. Just keep on feeding the solder in until it flows all the way through. So now that this one is soldered, we'll go ahead and tape this up really well. Make sure it's insulated so we don't have any exposed wire to cause any type of shorts. Now that this is all soldered in, I'll go ahead and tape this together. Just clean this up a bit. Now we can connect this back in here. With a ground wire, I'm going to put a ring terminal on it, and then using a self-tapping screw, I'll tap it right into one of the metal brackets here. So right now this probe is plugged into the red-blue wire on that connector to test the parking light, and I have the multimeter here. So let me turn on the parking light. It's a 12 volt. Turn off the parking light, and it goes to 0. You see that white wire, the thicker gauge one that's coming down? It's a very tight corner back there, and there's not a lot of slack on that wire for the parking light, but I was able to solder it on. Now I just have to tape it up. On this connector that I'm probing, which is right above the brake pedal, this is for the positive 12 volt. When the brake pedal is pressed. And looking at the multimeter, I'll press the brake pedal, and there's 12 volt. As you can see, I've already tapped the alarm's brown-black wire onto it and soldered it. Okay, these wires you see right now are going to be for the siren and also the hood pin switch. And really there's not a lot of places you can poke through to get into the engine bay. But if you follow the hood release cable, there is a grommet at the back, and you do have to probably cut open the insulation way back there so you can get access to that grommet. And then I fished that wire out, and this is where it comes out. It's behind the fender here, and I used a coat hanger to poke it through and then pull this cable out. Let me show you where I mounted the shock sensor. There's a metal bracket right behind where the brake is, and I had to put it there because underneath the dash here there's really not a lot of wire loom I can tie it to, and also the location I must be able to have access to that adjustment screw. I'm going to install the antenna right in this location, right up against here, so I don't see any of the wire. So hold it for about a minute so the adhesive will bond properly. We can tuck the wire behind the headliner. Now we'll remove the A-pillar. We'll run this along the wire loom behind it. Here's a Siren. I've connected the wiring to these two wires that go into the car. I'll find a location to mount this back here somewhere. Here's where I mounted the Siren with two self-tapping screws, and the wire is running in its own wire loom all the way around. I need to install this pin switch into the hood area so that when the hood is open it will ground this wire at the end here to the chassis ground, and that will stop the remote start and also prevent it from starting. So I've looked around and to see which contact point will match up to the hood area, and I believe right here there's a good bare spot which I can drill a hole and then mount this switch right in here. The pin switch is installed. As you can see, this wire, I ran it with the Siren wire at the same time. So whenever the hood is closed and switch is pushed down, then it will not have any connectivity to ground. Once the hood is open, then it'll ground that wire, and that's how the remote start alarm system will know not to start the car.